Today, I'm going to talk about the theme of nationalism in Amitava Ghosh's novel, The Shadow Lines. Amitava Ghosh announces his principal theme of nationalism and also his own attitude to it through the title of the book itself, The Shadow Lines. He distrusts nationalism and he thinks that it is a destructive force that draws lines or divisions between people and nations, and that is a source of terrifying violence. These lines, he believes, are arbitrary and inverted and illusory. So, according to Amitava Ghosh, the shadow lines are arbitrary, inverted, and illusory, and they have no business to be. They have no business to exist, according to the writer. As a corollary, he enquires into the meaning of distance and also into how the nation expects the people living within it to relate to it. So the exploration is done at two levels, the personal and the public, with both coming together in the 1964 Dhaka riots, in which Trideep, Ukil Babu, and Khalil, major characters of the novel, died. Amitava Ghosh's treatment of the theme tends to be idealistic. According to him, it was perfectly possible for India and the British to interact at a personal level without any barriers whatever. He illustrates this by showing the contacts between two families located so far apart as in India and in England over three generations, starting with the camaraderie between Justice Chandrasekhar, Datta Chaudhary, and Lionel Tresoswen in Calcutta in the late 19th century. The contacts continue in post-independent India in the form of visits to and from the love between Trideep and May. Amitava Ghosh's ideal is contained in the Tristan Isolde love story, which Snipe had told Trideep in the cellar in 1939. The story, he says, happened everywhere, wherever you wish it. And the narrator says that it was an old story, the best story in Europe, when Europe was a better place, a place without borders and countries. It was the story of a hero called Tristan, a very sad story about a man without a country who fell in love with a woman across the seas. Trideep recalls the ideal, calling May my love, my own true love, my love across the seas. And when he dies, the narrator, for whom Trideep is a role model, finds love and fulfillment in the arm of May. Interpersonal relationships find their perfection in love. The issue of interpersonal relationships between people across the nations is, however, more complicated than is suggested by the writer's presentation of it. Amitava Ghosh himself hints at the complexities posed by racism by giving two examples. In one, an Irishman, Mike, who is a visitor in Mrs. Price's house during World War II, insultingly asks their guest Shahib if he had been killed if he had killed any Englishmen yet. When the Sahib retreats in horror, Mike replies, "So what makes you Indian then?" Later, during Ela and her mother's stay at Mrs. Price's house in the 60s, we are told how on one occasion Nick had run away from Ela, leaving her to face racial insults from white children. But these examples are only limits and don't affect the writer's romantic view of the perfectibility of personal relations across the nations. The writer appears to be so committed to the ideal of a world society without national borders that he appears to have decided to overlook the complexities that can bedevil such relationships. And this is reflected in the lesson that the narrator has learnt. In the novel, we find some very important lines where the narrator says, I was a child, and like all the children around me, I grew up, believing in the truth of the precepts that were available to me. I believed in the reality of space. I believed that distance separates. I believed in the reality of nations and borders. I believed that across the border there existed another reality. The only relationship my vocabulary permitted between those separate realities was war or friendship. There was no room in it for this other thing. So, this is a very key statement of the book because it expresses the narrator's and the writer's distrust of nationalism and his faith in cosmopolitanism. The use of the past tense indicates that it is thus a clear repudiation of his earlier beliefs in the reality of nations and borders, beliefs that had been shaped under the influence of his grandmother and her brand of aggressive nationalism. The author drives home this point by choosing as the endpoints of his essential narrative two events, both of which are violent and which result from aggressive nationalism. He begins his narrative in 1939, which marks the beginning of World War II, and it essentially ends in 1964 when the tragic riots occurred in Dhaka. But surely, all nationalism need not be equally destructive. Nationalism can slide into chauvinism and even into jingoism. And when that happens, nationalism, as embodied in a nation state, can become an instrument of suppression and can kill the very freedom which it was meant to secure in the first place. Amitava Ghosh is also right in warning us of the tendency of nation states to try to claim the exclusive loyalty of its people. Independent relationship is the natural enemy of the government, for it is the logic of states that to exist at all, they must claim the monopoly of relationships between peoples. So, according to Amitava Ghosh, for the state there are only citizens and not people. But to equate all kinds of nationalism with chauvinism and to overlook the role of nationalism in securing freedom for enslaved people is a little too simplistic. So uh, there are countries where freedom has come more recently and which are still in the process of consolidating their national identity. Borders or lines constitutes the reality of life in the modern world, whether we want them or not. And we need to negotiate this reality if we are to move anywhere at all. These are the things which many people say. But in this novel, we will find that the Shadow Lines offers a severe indictment on the concept of nationalism.